Welcome to the Triage podcast with me, Gary McGowan, and my co-host, as always, Mr. Patrick Carl. Paddy, how are you?
I'm positively splendid, Gary. Although London the last while, it hasn't been as summery as I'd hoped. It's nice and warm. It's always in around the 20s to 25, nice, but it's just a little bit too overcast. But I suppose that is what you get for living in the British Isles. How's the weather over there for you?
In Mexico, I just left a place called Puerto Escondido, and that was kind of horrible to be honest, because it was just ruthlessly humid. Glad to have left there, and now in a more temperate area up in the mountains at about 2,200 meters in San Cristobal, something like that. But yeah, still warm, but just not as humid, which is much more enjoyable.
We love to see it. Anyway, Gary, what are we talking about today?
Today we're talking about field sports. So we're continuing the How to Train series, and we're moving to the focus on sports performance. And we're talking about field sports generally because it obviously encompasses a lot of different athletes who have a crossover in terms of their requirements, but definitely some differences. So this would be things like, Gaelic football, regular football or soccer, rugby, American football potentially, hockey, lots of different sports that could fit in here. They of course, as I said, have their own individual requirements, but they have some things in common in that you're required to be on your feet. You're required to do things like repeated sprints, jump, change direction, cover a certain amount of distance, could be 8 to 12 kilometers over the course of a match, and so on. So as a result, there, there are common features that we might look at in a strength conditioning program that someone would use to improve their sport performance both in and off season.
100%. I don't have much to add except that, you know, there are obviously differences. That's the thing that always, like, people always focus on. They're like, oh, well, the rugby is clearly different than football, like soccer. So we can't even consider the two of those. We treat them completely differently. And obviously, to an extent, yeah, that's right. Like if you're a rugby player, and especially if you're in certain positions, you're going to need to focus on certain aspects a bit more, i.e., say, for example, having more muscle mass, being stronger. Yeah, obviously, if you're tackling people, like rugby tackling people, you're going to need to be stronger. You're going to need to have more muscle mass. But there still are so many commonalities across like field sports that if you understand that kind of baseline, oh, these are the kind of things you need to be thinking about for field sports. And then I layer on the more specific stuff to my actual sport. It's actually a much easier way to conceptualize this stuff, especially if you're a coach. Because rather than having to learn about every single individual field sport, you're like, oh, I've learned the baseline, the commonalities, the foundational stuff, and I only need to learn about the specifics then if I'm coaching an individual with whatever goal.
Absolutely. And that's a segue nicely into our first segment, which is on the issue of needs analysis. So this is really important between sports and also within sport, like within sport differences and then within athlete differences. So, for example, if you're, playing in goal versus, being a striker in soccer, like they're very different requirements. Clearly there are massive differences in rugby as well. You can see this between, someone that's a winger versus someone that's a prop and so on. Okay, lots of differences there between those individual athletes, even just looking at them. Okay, so what you have to do first and foremost when you're thinking about trying to train for field sport, and I'm not talking about formal training that you do with your club. Of course, that's more or less controlled. I'm talking about the strength conditioning that you do in your own time or with the strength conditioning coach. You have to ask yourself, what's your position and what are the general characteristics of players in that position? Okay, really important. And obviously, there's a certain amount of selection over time. For example, if you're 25 years old, and you've been playing sport for 15 years, let's say, over time, you've probably been selected for into given positions based on your strength. Okay, so you probably know what they are. For example, is there a higher speed requirement in your position? Do you do far more rapid change of direction? Do you do more jumping? Do more tackling? Do you need to have a larger body mass for your position? And so on. This is a fundamental start because what it gives you is a rough idea of what you should be aiming for. For example, if you weigh 75 kg and an average player at a professional level is 85 to 90 kg in your position, then maybe it's the case that you're just an exception to the rule and there's something that makes you different and still well able to play in that position. That's perfectly possible. But it's also possible that not being at that body mass could be a limiting factor for your performance. So this is just such a basic starting point, but it's a really important one because this is something that you would look at in even combat sports, for example. If you were a combat sports athlete and you weighed 75 kg and you were in that weight class, but you seem to be have far more body fat and far less muscle than all the other guys that were in your weight class, then maybe the question would be, should you be in a lower weight class or should you be aiming to gain more muscle to maintain that weight class? Exact same thing applies here with respect to position.
100%. I don't have much to add. We've talked about it before, like a needs analysis, you're going to need to do it for every sport, but then also if you're an individual coaching yourself, training yourself, you're going to need to do it for what is wrong, or I shouldn't say wrong with your game, what is missing in your game. Maybe it is a fitness component, maybe it's a strength component, maybe it's body composition, etc., etc. Like obviously it's sports specific then, but, and I think you're going to note it now in a second, like that does, like being able to be accurate in that does actually really influence how we set up our training then. You know, is it, oh, like you, for example, you and I, we both like going to the gym. So it could be our bias to be like, oh yeah, let's go to the gym. Let's really focus on getting stronger, getting bigger, etc. Right? And we both do jujitsu. But if we're focusing all our energy on getting bigger, getting stronger, and it's actually taking away from our jujitsu, and it's not really something that we need to be focusing on because we're already at the top of our weight class, for example, or you know, we're already in a better body composition than the same people in that weight class, then why are we wasting our energy? You know, I would argue it's not wasting your energy, but that's my bias. But why are you really focusing all your energy on that when you would be better off focusing your energy on perhaps training more jujitsu or training more of your sport, your specific requirements, or perhaps maybe you have great body composition, you're strong enough, you have the, you know, muscle mass that you need, etc., but your cardiovascular fitness is nowhere near where it needs to be for your position or for your sport in general. Again, you need to do this needs analysis to identify where you're weak, because then it will allow you to actually create a more, and I was going to say consistent, a more appropriate program for your needs, you know? And the unfortunate thing is most people just skip this step. They'll type into Google or whatever, go, a 3-day gym rugby plan, and it'll give you this generic, oh yeah, here, focus on these things, do these movements, do this amount of volume in the gym. Cool. And yeah, that's great for getting you started, at least getting you into a training routine, whatever, but it might or might not be specific enough for your exact needs. And I know the two of us, we have a lot of clients on our roster, both now and in the past, from various field sports, where they've fallen down this trap of just following a generic plan of action or hearing these sound bites about their sport. Like we have a lot of, soccer players, for example, and they're like, oh, it's a repeated sprint sport, you know, so I need to be hammering sprints, I need to be like at the best possible like sprinting performance. But then you look at their actual like aerobic fitness and it's nowhere near where it actually needs to be able to have that repeated sprint effort occur, especially not for 90 minutes, and especially not if we've got multiple games per week, you know. So you can't just rely on the sound bites. You have to actually really dig a little bit deeper into the sport in general, the like the requirements, the needs of that sport, and then your needs as an athlete yourself.
Absolutely. And that's a good point because early on as an athlete, like let's say when you're a teenager, like a generalized plan of action is actually a pretty good thing because what you're trying to do early on as an athlete is be somewhat of general. So you're trying to develop a general base fitness quality. And then over time, as you mature, you're able to identify more specific weaknesses that you can then address. So I had this conversation with a soccer player who I was coaching recently, and he was, putting on himself that he needed to get 2 maximal intensity sprint sessions per week on top of the rest of the training. He had just, kind of heard that that was a good idea, and he thought it was a good idea, and it would be potentially if that was a big weakness in his game and we really needed to focus on developing it. However, it wasn't. And he was also dealing with a couple of injuries that were, in my estimation, likely provoked by all these high intensity efforts. So what we did was we just pulled out one of those sprint sessions, reduced the volume of the one that we kept in, because his speed was already a strength in his game. So there wasn't a point in adding all of this fatigue to a mode of training that wasn't going to contribute to betterment of his performance. We also see this a lot in field sports athletes who have a kind of a simultaneous interest in, let's say, bodybuilding and physique development. So they, they like going to the gym because they want to look good as well. But they end up training as if they're a professional bodybuilder, and it ends up taking away from their game potentially. And that's fine if the game isn't your priority. But if it is your priority, then the efforts that you're putting in are potentially compromising performance. So priorities and then needs analysis. The other thing you can do here when it comes to identifying weaknesses is ask yourself, what have you or others identified as the weaknesses in your game? So, for example, look back over the last season that you played and ask yourself, what really let me down last season? Was it recurring injuries, for example? Was it that I could never keep up with the player because of speed? Was it that I was gassing later on in games? And was it that I didn't have the body mass, the power to overcome my opponent? And then ask yourself, what have others told you? Other players, maybe scouts that have visited the club, your club manager, your S&T coach, etc. And try to be as objective about that as you can. Because if you're not objective about that, what you end up doing is kind of maybe what's trendy or maybe what everyone else is doing or what you feel you should be doing, but you're not being objective about it. Okay. So that's really important. And then the final component
Just on that as well, like this, it's actually so hard to do because it does require a good bit of like introspection. Because one of the things might be something like your attitude, like your actual attitude, like, oh, I turn up late and I go home early and stuff like that, where you're just like they're all fine. Like if you're doing this as a hobby, like cool, no big deal. But if you are someone that's really trying to milk your field sports performance for all it's worth, you kind of need to be that person that's, I show up early and I'm the last person to leave and I'm volunteering to clean up afterwards and maybe get a few extra minutes of, training in or whatever, so it is quite hard to do a needs analysis and be honest with yourself, because while we're obviously focusing on the more strength and conditioning aspects of things here and maybe the health aspects as well, some of the things are just more psychological, more the way you interact with the sport, which obviously, again, you do have to be a lot more introspective then. Like if someone says you just have a shit attitude to the sport, you're not a team player, like you have to take that on board. And that might be something that you need to work on. Now, you might not know how to, but at least you've identified the pitfall in your game.
Absolutely. And that then comes to the final key question of needs analysis itself, which is, do you really have strength conditioning deficit, or is this a skill or sport specific issue? Okay, this is so important because you can't just see your way out of non-SNC problems. This is something that you see a lot in jiu-jitsu, for example. You look at the top guys and you look at what they actually do for training, and it's like, okay, they all have very different strength training programs. Some of them kind of train like bodybuilders, some of them train in more of what might look like a sports specific fashion. And yeah, there's probably some role for these types of things there. But fundamentally, what they do is they drill jiu-jitsu, the sport, the skills for hours and hours and hours and hours every single day for years on end. Okay. And that's absolutely key. It's something that I get asked about a lot. People are like, oh, I know, I just started training jiu-jitsu. Have you any tips for me for my strength conditioning? And at that point, like strength conditioning probably isn't your problem. You just need to keep showing up to class. And it's the exact same when it comes to field sport. Okay. Are you, let's say you're a GA player or soccer player, like, are you accurate? Are you accurate when you're kicking the ball? It's so basic, how's your catching? How's your dummying? How's your soloing? All these different skills that are fundamental to the sport itself need to be a big focus in your training. So you could be the fittest guy, you could be the strongest guy, you could be the most powerful guy. But if you're not able to accurately kick the ball over the bar, you're not able to catch, you're not able to perform the other sport specific skills of your sport, not really going to get anywhere. Okay, if it was that simple, we'd have Usain Bolt, then we'd go to the Olympics to find all these peak athletes and have them all come and play sport. Okay, so that's incredibly important. Don't miss out on that.
100%. So with that in mind, Gary, field sports, where do we actually start with all this? Like, again, we'll call it strength and conditioning. It's just training.
Yeah, so I think conditioning or cardio, fitness training, whatever you want to call it, is probably one of the core areas common to all field sports. Okay, you simply need to be very fit. Okay, you need to have a solid aerobic base, you need to have sprint ability, you need to have repeated sprint ability, etc. So all field sports athletes, whether it's rugby, soccer, or so on, require a powerful aerobic engine. Okay, so you should start by referring to the needs analysis that we referred to and asking yourself, am I gassing in games? When we do aerobic tests pre-season or during the season, am I underperforming? Am I underperforming relative to players in my position? Am I underperforming relative to the team as a whole? Okay, that then tells you how much priority you need to put onto or into your conditioning program, because what you have to realize is that you're already doing conditioning work as part of your club training. So let's say you're training 3 nights a week, you're doing running, you're running laps, you're doing some sprints, all that is in there. And for some players, that might be enough for them to actually be at a high level of fitness relative to other players on the team. But for others, it may not. Okay. So what you can identify is where you stand on that ladder. And if you're the person that you're doing all the same training as others on the pitch, but your aerobic engine is clearly much poorer, then that needs to be a priority for you, both within the season and in the off season. Okay. So what you can do is you review your team's training week, then you can add aerobic work accordingly. So for example, this could be after a skill session. So maybe on a Wednesday evening, you have a skill session where it's a lower fatigue session and you've got a gym on site or a gym that you can access. That'd be a good time to go and do some additional aerobic work. Okay, so you're going to do conditioning work there when you've had a low fatigue session. You could also, do it as a recovery session after a game or in the morning ahead of a session later on, and so on. But the idea here is that you want to fill in a couple of gaps in your week with additional aerobic work so that you're building fundamentally that aerobic engine. Okay, so that can look like that can be set up in multiple different ways. For example, if you find that you have your legs are still super fresh, you might do some additional running. If you find that your legs aren't that fresh, you've got muscle soreness already, maybe you're going to do a lower impact activity like a bike or a stationary bike, cross trainer, etc. All you're doing is trying to get additional aerobic adaptation. So what you might do is maybe 30 to 60 minutes at around zone 2 or so. So you're looking at about 60 to 70% of your maximal heart rate. If you're doing that on top of your additional training, and you're doing that maybe 2 to 3 times per week, probably at most from a practical perspective, then that will contribute to you having a higher level of aerobic fitness. And it's definitely something you can prioritize in the off season, because you can then maintain that in season. So if you put a lot of effort into this in the off season, those adaptations are there and they just have to be maintained. Okay. So from an aerobic perspective, I think it's a really basic point. You need to have very solid aerobic fitness. It can be trained in multiple ways, but it all starts with the needs analysis and identifying, is this something that you really need to work on? Do you need more endurance? Do you need more stamina? And if you're gassing out always in the last 15 minutes of games, you're always underperforming an aerobic test, the answer to that question will be yes.
Yeah, and I think the vast majority of people, well, I shouldn't say the vast majority, if they're athletes already, maybe not, but the vast majority of people that tend to be more recreational athletes, they probably need a bit more of an aerobic gas tank than they actually think they do. Like you can go into some more quote unquote objective measures, being like, oh, what's your resting heart rate? Is it sub 50? Sub 50, you're probably aerobically quite fit. You could maybe use HRV or something. If your HRV is over 70 consistently, probably quite fit. But those two things are also influenced by so many other things: stress levels, sleep, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not quite perfect. So going back to that needs analysis, you start looking at how you perform in the games, how you recover between sessions. Are you someone that always has to be subbed off after halftime or whatever because your performance is just slowly, quite quickly, actually, just going down into the bin, right? Because you start off great, but then as soon as you have to do more and more repeated sprints, you just don't have the ability, right? So you have to go back to that needs analysis. You have to identify where you're weak. And for the vast majority of people, I would argue that it is that aerobic fitness. And that's somewhat unfortunate, especially if you are doing this recreationally, because training your aerobic system is probably the system that takes the most time to train. Like you have to just dedicate a lot of hours to it, not just like, oh, I can get stronger with a 30-minute gym session twice per week. I have a lot of sports athletes that do that. They're consistently getting stronger, and their actual training sessions quite short. They're just like, all right, cool, there's a gym on site, and I just do a quick 30-minute session, and I'm still consistently getting stronger. Whereas if it's your aerobic system that needs work, you just need to put in the hours, and unfortunately it takes a lot of time. And that is why there is a huge focus on, we'll do some high intensity interval training for your sport. Your sport is a repeated sprint sport, so this is the thing that makes the most sense. And that's true to an extent. Like, yeah, doing some high intensity interval training will improve your aerobic fitness, especially if there's a larger volume of it. That there's no denying that. But, and especially in a sporting context, there's a lot of fatigue generated from that. And the thing that I say to a lot of my athletes, the thing that changes between being like a beginner to an intermediate athlete and then to an advanced athlete is the ability to manage fatigue appropriately. Like you see beginner athletes, they just basically blow their load every single week. They go in and they're like, I'm just gonna fucking train as hard as possible in the gym. So I know I'm fatigued from that. I'm going to train as hard as possible with my conditioning stuff. I'm really doing like a lot of anaerobic intervals and blah, blah, blah. And they're just super fatigued from that. And then they get to the game and they're fatigued. They don't perform as well. Whereas you see intermediate and advanced athletes, they know when to push and they also know when to pull back. And they know how hard they should be training so that they're able to perform when they are supposed to perform, and that's just a very hard thing to do. It's a very hard thing for me to explain for all you guys, tell you what to do if this is just a generalized podcast, but it is really important, and it really does come back to that fundamental needs analysis. And if you're in doubt, it probably comes back to building a bigger aerobic gas tank.
Absolutely. Now, with that said, it doesn't mean there's no place for speed and interval work. This can be incredibly important. Okay, as Paddy said, there's time efficiency in terms of just doing hard interval. It does build your aerobic fitness, but when bringing in speed and interval work, you just have to be a bit more specific about what you're doing. So number one, what I would do is if I'm doing closer like maximal short sprints, or I'm doing slightly longer, really hard lactic sprints. I'll come back to those definitions in a moment. But if you're doing those, what you generally want to do is have them in that kind of Monday to Thursday window if you have a match at the weekend. So, for example, let's say you're playing a match on Saturday, that's always when your matches are. If you do really hard sprints on a Friday, you're going to underperform on Saturday because you're going to be fatigued, you're going to be sore. If had you done a light aerobic session, it wouldn't have had that effect. Maybe you might be a little bit defeated for what you would have been, but the key consideration with this more anaerobic cardio, sprint interval cardio, is that it is more fatiguing. It can lead to more muscle soreness, and that's particularly the case if done with a weight bearing activity. Okay, so if you're doing sprinting, you get a lot of loading, and as when muscles are stretched, you get eccentric loading of tendon band muscles, and that can lead to a lot more muscle soreness versus something like, let's say, an assault bike. The beauty of which is that it is primarily a concentric activity, okay, rather than involving eccentric loading. So these are the practical considerations that should come into your interval planning. So I would say Monday to Thursday, when you would do that sprint or anaerobic type of activity, ideally closer to the start of the week, so you have more time to recover. Again, it comes back to how the rest of your week is structured. And what you need to do then is ask yourself, what am I actually trying to prioritize? Is it maximal speed and or maximal acceleration? Okay, slightly different, but is that what you're looking for? And over what distance? Or is it just anaerobic capacity that you're trying to develop? So for example, it's the ability to, it's not necessarily the speed that you're trying to achieve, but rather the maintenance of that speed and the ability to overcome that muscle burning, let's say, that you get later on in the game? Is it the repeat sprint ability that you need to work on? These are actually different things, because if you go out and you do, let's say, 100-meter sprint, and you do 10 reps of that with 30 to 60 seconds between, that is going to be a brutal session, but it's not going to make you faster. Okay, if you're a beginner, it might, but it's probably not going to make you faster, because what you're doing there is in the first rep, yeah, you're going to be training maximum speed. You're going to be working on trying to really maximize how fast you can run. But in subsequent reps, you're going to slow down, slow down, slow down, slow down. Really hard anaerobic training. You're getting a lot of aerobic volume in there as well, but it's not taking you towards maximum speed. So you need to know the difference between those types of sessions, maybe 100 to 400-meter intervals that you might be doing, or 10 to 30-second intervals on an assault bike, versus you going out and doing 20 to 60-meter sprints with adequate recovery between, so that you're able to hit max velocity. They're very different things, and people often don't differentiate between the two, which is why I don't really like the term just HIIT or interval, because what exactly you mean can vary a lot.
Yeah, and this is, again, goes back to that needs analysis. Like, you have to be so specific. Well, if you're a beginner, you can probably afford to be more generalized. But again, once you start getting into that intermediate and advanced, you need to be more and more specific. Like, maybe you are fast enough, maybe you are able to keep that up, but your change of direction is shit. You know, like if it's a straight line, that you're good. But as soon as there's a bit of zigzagging going in, you're off. Or perhaps it is a case that as soon as someone gives you a little bit of a knock while you're at top speeds, then you're off. You know, so all of these things have to be trained differently. And obviously some of them are easier to train, like going out and just being like, oh, here's a field, I can just run in a straight line, happy days, you know, versus if I'm like, oh, it is when I get a knock and then I can't recover that momentum or whatever, you know, that's a lot harder to train, but you can train that. You can be more specific with that. But first of all, you have to identify it. You have to identify, oh, well, that's actually the area that I need to improve on, you know? So again, I agree with you, Gary. When we're talking about intervals or anaerobic training or sprint training or whatever, we need to be specific. And not only do we need to be specific with what we're actually trying to train, we also need to be specific with regards to the recovery from that. And I mean both during the session and then after the session, because you see this all the time across the board, across various athletes. They'll try to turn their sprint training sessions into these like death sessions, being like, all right, I'm doing some sort of like 30-second sprint and I'm only going to take 30 seconds recovery. And yeah, that's definitely a potential method for creating some sort of metabolic, you know, stress on the body, but that's not the way that you maximize your performance in a 30-second sprint. Like, you want complete or almost complete, at least, recovery from that, you know? So you're probably going to do, 30-second sprint with 3, maybe even 5 minutes rest in between, you know? And again, there's potential to do other things during that, potential to do like skill work, like you're doing like some sort of like active recovery and you're just dribbling the ball, for example. You know, there is still potential for stuff to do in that recovery period, but you're not just going, oh yeah, I'm just going to do 30-second sprint, 30 seconds off, 30-second sprint, 30 seconds off. You know, it's just not the best way to set things up. So again, we need to be cognizant of the recovery demands during the session, like what's the best way to maximize the performance in that session and the training adaptations in that session. But then also, how long is it going to take me to recover from this? You know, if I do 20 hard sprints, even if I take enough recovery in between them, am I now dead for a week? Like, are my legs now just in bits for a week? You know, am I just destroyed? Like, that's very possible. You know, 20 hard sprints, like, that's a lot. That's a big recovery. Like, imagine you did 20 hard sets of squats, for example, right? You'd be like, right, that was a hard workout, you know, if you're used to training in the gym. So why would you think any different from sprinting? Like, it's quote unquote maximal effort, even if it's, you know, sub-maximal. Like, you need to think about the rest of your week. And again, this goes back to what I said earlier on about like beginners. They just blow their load early. They just go, oh yeah, I'm just going to go in and destroy myself in this session with no regard for what's coming up later in the week or later in the month or later in the year, you know? Whereas those intermediate and advanced people, they're going, okay, yeah, well, actually, if I train that hard on, even if it's a Monday and I have a game on Saturday, I'm probably still going to feel some fatigue in my legs. I'm probably going to still feel a little bit drained, So during the training sessions during the week, the coach is going to be looking at me going, he's not fit to play. He's not at his best, he needs more rest. So then you don't even get that game, So intermediate and advanced, they know when to push and they know when to pull back. And I would say for the vast majority of people training all sports, if they actually just trained or went into training with the thought process of training a little bit below their capacity, like just keeping a little bit more in the tank, they would actually get way more out of their sport. Maybe not just initially, they might see, oh, there's no difference over a month, 3 months, maybe even 12 months. But across their whole career, their whole training career, they're going to get less injuries. They're going to have more playing time. They're going to be more rested when it's important to be rested so that they can actually perform, So that is something that it just takes time to learn, and you just have to be cognizant of it.
Absolutely. And I think that the parallel with strength training really helps to illustrate this point to people because, like, if you're a powerlifter and you try to do, let's say, 5 sets of 5 at 85 to 90% of 1 rep max, so you're going pretty much to failure on each set of 5, and you do that with 45 to 60 seconds rest, how do you think that would go for maximal strength development? Very poorly. Okay, you're not going to be recovered between sets. This is why powerlifters will rest so much between sets. They're trying to recover their ability to have maximal or close to maximal output again. And that's the exact same here when it comes to maximal sprint ability. So in summary there, you've kind of got 3 primary modes of conditioning that you can do. You've got your speed training, which is maximal, short, and rested. Okay, so you want to be well rested between bouts. Obviously, the rest is proportional. If you're just doing 5 to 10 meter acceleration versus 40 to 60 meter sprint, the rest will vary. You've got your aerobic training. Okay, so that's your easy, long, continuous work. And then you've got your anaerobic or lactic training, which is extremely hard, short, moderate in terms of intensity. It could be anywhere between 10 and 60 seconds. It might even be up to 3 minutes of maximal effort or close to maximal effort. And it's generally very fatiguing. Okay. And obviously, there's crossover between all 3 of these domains, but thinking of them in that way can help you to try to map out your training a little bit. Now, of course, when it comes to field sport, there are a couple of additional elements that feed in there. For example, like you mentioned previously, is your straight line running fantastic, but when it comes to changing direction, training agility, etc., these are additional challenges for you. These things are actually your limiting factors. Then they might come in and factor into your speed training. For example, you might do a sprint out to a cone and then change direction, or a sprint out waiting for someone to tell you which direction to run, so that you immediately have to make that decision. Okay, so there's many different ways to put that into practice. There's many different ways of putting all the conditioning training practice or into practice in general. But I think that's a fair summary of the things you should be thinking about planning conditioning training for field sport.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to this, and it's obvious enough, is that most field sports have on seasons and off seasons, and you're going to be able to train potentially harder during your off season, but that doesn't necessarily always mean that you should, right? And the reason I say that is because so many people go into their season with a boatload of fatigue because they spent their off season, whether it was 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, obviously it depends on the sport, but they spent all that off season absolutely destroying themselves, which is fine. We all want to train hard, but again, you need to be ready when you're supposed to be ready, And I very often do this. Like, I know I have a few athletes right now who are thinking, okay, well, sports start again in September, so we're going to still be maximizing our training. We're still going to be maximizing our performance right now, but we need to be thinking, okay, well, I want to have at least a week, maybe 2 weeks of this kind of like tapering before I actually get back into the season itself, so that I can wash away that fatigue, right? So you do need to think about this stuff on a yearly, ideally multi-yearly time scale, and that's just hard for a lot of people because, again, it's just a recreational thing. You're not thinking like, when should I organize my holiday so that I can maximize my recovery going into my training season. I know a lot of people, they do actually do that because sport is a big part of their life, but you do kind of need to be thinking, well, when is it appropriate to push and when is it appropriate to pull back? So that's just something that I wanted to make a note of.
Absolutely. And then that brings us to the second big category of training, which is resistance training. Okay, this is obviously a big part of the strength component in particular of strength conditioning. It may be self-led or it may be club-led, coach-led. It totally depends on the sport and the level at which you're playing. Okay, different clubs have different resources. You may or may not have a strength conditioning coach. So there are, again, hugely variable requirements. If you're a prop in rugby, you need a lot of muscle mass, you need a lot of strength. You know, if you're a winger in soccer, you play on the left wing, and your whole game is based on, you know, you being fast, you being skillful, etc. You know, having a 200-300 kilo deadlift probably isn't as important. But most athletes in most field sports and sports in general probably would benefit from greater relative strength and greater muscle to fat mass ratio. So what I mean by that is relative strength, meaning that the amount you can lift relative to your body weight. So for example, if you're 80 kg and every other player is 80 kg, but you have a considerably stronger deadlift, you know, over double body weight versus everyone else, which is just 1 times body weight, that's an advantage. Okay. If you had that same deadlift, but you had to gain 20 kilos of body mass, it may not be an advantage. Similarly, when it comes to the muscle to fat mass ratio, fat doesn't do much for you in sport, or at least in most sports. Okay. Obviously, there's an advantage of having some extra fat in terms of just mass for certain positions in rugby, and for a sport like sumo wrestling, of course. So some sports, but there will be an advantage of having a little bit of extra fat mass just to make up some extra mass. But generally speaking, the more of your weight is composed of muscle and the less composed of fat, the better an athlete you will be. Remember, muscle does the work. So if you're, you know, sprinting, let's say you need to be able to sprint, and you were to think about having an extra 5 kilos of muscle versus 5 kilos of fat, 5 kilos of muscle is actually going to do something for you. 5 kilos of fat is literally just being carried. Okay. So if you have an extra kilo of hamstring muscle versus an extra kilo of fat on your leg, the hamstring muscle can produce force. Okay, it can be trained in order to have high velocity strength and high speed properties. But the fact it's not to do anything for you, literally just being carried. Okay, so those two key elements are common to pretty much all sports.
Yeah, and the really hard thing about this is that some sports, like say for example, again, rugby, like the ideal would be that you have low body fat and just boatloads of muscle. However, that's actually quite hard to do.
Yes.
So you do have to have this little bit of a trade-off where, okay, you know, all the other players that are in my position are 120 kilos. And yeah, I'm 100 kilos of muscle, but they're still 20 kilos heavier than me, you know? So if I'm taking a hit from them or I'm trying to defend them or whatever it is, whatever the sport is, you know, you still have to have that trade-off where they have 20 kilos more than you and mass just moves mass, you know? So you might actually have to gain some more fat. The ideal would be that you were just able to gain more muscle, but that's not always the case. So even though fat mass is not ideal when compared to muscle, that doesn't mean to say that you're never prioritizing it. You're never trying to intentionally gain some fat. However, the trade-off in a sporting context is that you now have to carry around for the vast majority of time, whatever, 10, 5, 10, 15, 20 kilos of quote unquote unfunctional mass. Yeah, it's functional when you're taking that hit and you've 20 kilos of extra mass to help you, or 20 kilos of extra mass to do the tackle. But then all of the other time, you have to run around with that. You have to carry, you have to basically run around with a 20-kilo weight vest on, you know? So that's the trade-off. And that's really hard, especially in a sport like rugby, where you kind of really do have to be a little bit bigger, you know? You do have to have a bit more mass, especially for certain positions. Obviously, other positions, it's not the case. But in most sports, you're probably going to want to be on the leaner side of things and have that little bit more muscle mass. That doesn't mean that you have to have maximal amounts of muscle mass. Like if you're a soccer player, like I would argue that it's not really all that functional. Like, yeah, obviously to an extent it is. If it's all located on your legs, for example, you would presume you have better ability, at least, or capacity, I should say, to be able to sprint faster, generate more power, jump higher, whatever, right? But you still have to carry around that mass. He still has to carry around that weight. So there is a balancing point here depending on the exact sport.
Yeah. You don't all have to have calves like Jack Grealish, although that would be the ideal, you know. Don't know if
All I'm
you
saying,
double
all I'm
check.
saying is if you look at any of the best sporting athletes, none of them have calves. In any fight sport, all the best athletes, no calves. In all of the like sprint sports, no calves. Jumping sports, no calves. So it's just something, it's maybe not causation, maybe it's just correlation, maybe it's just a little bit of cope by my lack of calves, but calves are a non-functional muscle.
Those big, thick, bungee cords, Achilles instead.
That's all you need. Literally just this thick, you know, yeah.
So on the note of really important muscles, what you should do when you're doing resistance training for field sports is prioritize quote unquote functional muscles. And what I mean by that are muscles that play a primary role in your sporting activity. Okay. Probably don't need to say this, but obviously if you're playing soccer, hamstrings and glutes are probably important. Chest and biceps, less so. Okay. It does vary, of course. There's considerable advantage again in rugby to having strong upper body, but in soccer, not so much. Okay, it's probably not going to do much for you. You're barely allowed to tackle when you do. People just dive anyway. So it's not a very heavy contact sport these days. So prioritize muscles that are actually going to give you a return on investment, because this actually also contributes to um, the relative strength component and the muscle the muscle to overall body mass ratio of particular muscles. And what I mean by this is, let's say Lance Armstrong is probably the best example of this. When he was cycling Tour de France, the story goes that he wouldn't even carry shopping or anything because he didn't want any extra muscle mass on his upper body. Okay, because he wanted to be aerodynamic, he wanted to have to carry any additional muscle mass. He just wanted to be able to cycle. That was it. That was his only goal. So, to some extent, it's similar in field sports. So if you're a soccer player, having some upper body muscle mass maybe might be a small advantage, but it's lower body muscle mass that's really going to give you the advantage. So if you could take the player, both of them 80 kg, and take 5 k, or one of them has an extra 10 kg of upper body muscle mass, and one is 10 kg of lower body muscle mass. The lower body muscle mass can at least do something for that player. That's not to say, again, that having massive legs is important, but rather that if you are going to prioritize your resistance training, it would be more advantageous to focus on the muscles that are active for your sport. Okay.
Yeah, and this is also another really hard thing because you ideally still want to be strong in your upper body, regardless of your sport. Like if it's soccer, for
Yeah,
example,
absolutely.
and Gary's saying, "Oh, look, you don't really need to use your upper body. You can hardly even tackle." Like, yes, that's true, but even stuff like just being able to like have the elbow out to hold off a player when you're both like right beside
Yeah.
each other running for a ball, like you still need to be strong in that position. You still need to be strong in the upper body to, just be able to physically hold yourself up, physically maneuver yourself in the environment. There's a bit of jostling in, whatever, there's a corner or something. Like you still need to have some sort of physicality about you. But with the limited training time that we have, the limited training budget that we have, spending 20 hours trying to get your upper body, get your forearms, get your, deltoids to be as perfectly symmetrical as possible, that's probably not the best use of your time, right? So you just have to prioritize the things that make the biggest difference for your sport, for your position. Again, going back to that needs analysis. But and again, maybe it's our bias, we would probably still say that being strong in the upper body is a good thing, even if it isn't necessarily perfectly applicable for your sport, it is definitely a benefit for your long-term health, like I don't think that's debatable really.
Absolutely. And I mean, we certainly can't make the argument that upper body strength is going to, or upper body muscle mass will slow you down very much. If you look at the 100-meter sprint physique, they've got more than enough muscle mass. So, it's not really going to slow you down. It's a case of just prioritization. That's all we're talking about. We have to be practical here. So, what you might do is consider yourself as a fairly general upper body training. So maybe you do a horizontal push and horizontal pull on a Monday, and then you do a vertical pull, vertical push on a Wednesday, something like that. But where you're getting far more specific is in your lower body training. So in your lower body training, what you'd be thinking about are things like, for example, hypertrophy and strength generally further in the off season, pre-season. So you're thinking about trying to maybe build up muscle mass if you don't have much muscle mass, or developing maximal strength. You do that further from the season. Then you want to convert that, so to speak, or specialize that in the form of high velocity strength, power, and speed as it comes to the in-season period. So, for example, you might change from doing maximal sets of 3 to 5 reps on a squat to doing something like repeated sets of 3 with 60% of 1 rep max, where you're performing the concentric really explosively, something like that. You might bring in jump squats for plyometric ability and explosiveness. You're basically looking at your resistance training in a phased, periodized approach, where hypertrophy and strength is more of a focus further from the season, and the higher velocity, power, and speed components are more of a priority as it comes into the season. That doesn't have to be absolute. It's not a strict change. You can do bits of both at each respective point in the season or the year, but it's just a case of where you put your priority. Okay. And the other thing is that when you're focusing on hypertrophy and strength, generally what that looks like is you're doing more overall training. You're doing more overall training volume. But then when it comes to the in-season period, we've already mentioned that you're going to be doing your field training. You're focusing on your sport-specific training. You're focusing on the conditioning that we've mentioned. So clearly doing an additional 5 days of intense resistance training isn't going to be in your best interest, really. So it might be that you just do maintenance resistance training volume, maybe 2 sessions per week, versus doing your 3 to 4 sessions per week in the off season. Okay. And again, all comes back to priorities. This also ties in with kind of rehab and prehab considerations as well, because resistance training plays an important role here. For example, if you have recurrent hamstring strains or recurrent Achilles tendinopathy or whatever it happens to be, that might be more of a priority area for you. Similarly, you could have had many issues with your back, maybe. So you mightn't think of it as being a very important part of your sport, but you could have had lots of low back pain or current low back injuries or muscle strains. Maybe that's something that's more of a focus for you as an individual. So it all depends on, again, going back to the needs analysis, and not just strengths and weaknesses, but also injuries that you've had in the past and how that then factors in to your resistance training.
Yeah, 100%. And this is one of those things as well where it really depends on what you actually need. Again, going back to that needs analysis, like I've had lots of trainees, athletes that we still really just focus on getting stronger, getting a little bit bigger in the off season and throughout the season. Now, yeah, we might put a little bit more emphasis on it in the off season, and we're just kind of more at a what I always call a maintenance phase during the season. Excuse me, where we're still focusing on like general hypertrophy exercises, rep ranges, etc. But we're not necessarily pushing the volume, pushing the intensity, etc., etc. We might do that for 2-3 years, and that's okay, because that was the biggest thing that they actually needed. They just needed to be generally a bit stronger, generally a bit bigger. They didn't need, they were okay in terms of speed. They're okay in terms of all those other qualities that we could potentially be focusing on in the gym, right? Now, there usually comes a point where we're like, right, we don't necessarily need to get much stronger. We don't necessarily need to get much bigger. Now we need to really hammer down on, okay, can we, quote unquote, convert that into really sports specific, exercise selection, really sports specific exercise modalities, et cetera, so even though Gary is saying that the ideal case here is, yes, have this like general phase-based training, that's not always the case. And similar to what we said earlier on about like the aerobic fitness side of things, where most people probably need to spend a little bit more time with just general getting fitter, getting more of an aerobic base. I would argue that a lot of people just generally need to get a bit more consistent with some sort of resistance training. And probably the easiest way to do that is to have this like quasi bodybuilding style training where you're doing like 3 sets of 6 to 8 reps, not excessively fatiguing, not, well, they would say like 2 to 3 reps from failure, maybe 4 reps from failure during the season, maybe a little bit lower volume. You're only doing 2 sets, whatever, right? For a lot of people, that's probably all they realistically need to do, and that should be their focus. But once you start getting into those kind of more intermediate and advanced ranks, then you kind of need to be focusing on other things.
Absolutely. I don't think I have too much else to add really on the resistance training or conditioning component. The only thing I'd like to wrap up on is, again, just reiterating that point that there are sport-specific skills that cannot really be trained all that well in your S&C training. And I'd encourage you to avoid like over specialized training. And what I mean by that is just trying to replicate your sport in the gym. You see people do this all the time where they try to just replicate sport specific activities with, cables, or they're trying to overcomplicate things like trying to squat on an uneven surface, like a bowl ball or something like that, so that they can practice their balance and these types of things. But these are all really low yield activities. And just because it looks a bit more like your sport or it seems like it's more advanced, it often doesn't have much of a high yield. And what you see amongst the best athletes, and especially those that make the most improvements to their strength conditioning, is that they focus on their resistance training, in a way that they need to, okay, as we discussed, in accordance with the needs analysis. They focus on their conditioning. They don't do anything all that fancy. They're doing the hard stuff on the assault bike. They're doing the sprint work. They're doing their slow, boring aerobic work. And maybe they do some additional stuff that's focused on their own injuries that they've had. But really, the rest of it is comes down to the sport stuff. Okay, it's you on the pitch practicing your kicks. It's you, having certain cues that you use in certain situations on the pitch, and so on. Okay, that's the core of sport. S&C is supplementary.
Yeah, the only thing I want to just expand on there, excuse me, is on the injury prevention side of things. Like a lot of this just comes down to building general robustness, like being strong all over. However, if you can identify things in that needs analysis where you're like, oh, well, I play this sport and these are very common injuries, these are very frequent injuries that happen in my position in whatever, rugby, whatever the fuck sport you play, right? Identify them, then maybe identify injuries that you've had in the past or you struggle with, and then integrate that into your programming. Be like, okay, I always have frequent shoulder injuries, can we come up with a just generalized strengthening of that shoulder girdle area? Maybe it's not, you're not actually doing any specific, rehab or prehab or whatever you want to call it work. Like you're not sitting there doing like Cuban rotations or, rotator cuff, excuse me, rotator cuff exercises or anything like that. You're just, oh, I'm just going to do a dumbbell shoulder press. I'm just generally going to get my shoulders a bit more strong, a bit stronger, a bit more robust. It could look like that. But this is something that you should have an eye to. If you have frequent recurring injuries, that's going to have to be taken into account in your program design. If there are frequent recurring injuries or frequent injuries that happen in your sport and in your position, again, you want to just have an eye to that. And it's a little bit beyond the scope of this episode because it's obviously sport specific, injury specific, person specific. But if you can build a little bit more robustness, both just in a general sense and then in a specific sense to whatever injuries are likely to occur in your sport, that's a good thing. And it doesn't have to be excessive. It could literally be just part of your program, whether it's just an exercise or two that you have in your program, whether it's just you pay a little bit more attention in your warm up or cool down or whatever to those areas, or maybe you just have like a bit more of a focus. You're like, all right, I consistently have hamstring issues, so I'm gonna actually just spend a lot more time really rehabbing this, really prehabbing this, really just getting those hamstrings as strong as possible. Like it just has to be taken account of in your overall program design. I don't know if you have anything to say on that, Gary.
No, I mean, I totally agree, really. I think that when it comes to injury prevention, we talk about it all the time. Like load management is a core factor, considering what sport it is a core factor, and then your injury history. So, for example, if I was going to play field sport, I'd be really focusing on my hamstrings. They'd be my absolute priority. I wouldn't be worried too much about trying to spend that time preventing quad strains or anything because I don't have a basis for that. Okay, my hamstrings are a weak point. My adductors have been a weak point in the past. And that's just personal knowledge of what I need to work on. For you, it might be your calves. So don't just focus on just the general. Do try to zoom in on specific, and that will then guide you. Because far too many people do these like complex, like so-called injury prehab and rehab routines to prevent injury, but they do them for muscles and joints that they've never had an issue with, and not to the point of getting any additional adaptation. So it's unclear why we're spending time on those activities.
Yeah, like again, you see people doing 40 minutes of a generalized prehab, rehab before they even get into hard training, and now all they are is fatigued for their actual training.
So yeah, I think that summarizes most of what we wanted to cover when it comes to training for field sports. Hopefully you have some take-home points. I think the big thing that we mentioned so many times is just that needs analysis component. It is so important. It's so important for us as, jiu-jitsu athletes or trainees. Again, we're not going to the gym every day thinking, God, I definitely need to have an extra 10 kilos of muscle mass in order to get better at jiu-jitsu. Like, that'd be nice. I would take it, but probably more time drilling, probably more time revising technique is going to be much higher yield. And that's important for the vast majority of sport. Okay. So that concludes the end of this episode. If you'd like assistance with your training or nutrition, we do have a coaching service that we run. We have full coaching, which involves training, nutrition, and all the rest. And then we have nutrition only coaching. If you'd like to work with us in either of those capacities, you can find information about that in the description box below. On the nutrition note, our nutrition coaching certification will be reopening in about 6 months' time. So coming toward the end of 2023 or January 2024, you'll be seeing the launch. So that pre-launch will be a little bit earlier for those of you who are on the wait list, and you'll also get additional incentives such as discounts, etc., on signing up. So make sure that you are on the wait list if you are interested in getting certified as a nutrition coach with Triage. And again, the link to that will be in the description box below. We have a lot of other information that we put out on our social media at Triage Method. Instagram is probably where we're most active, but you'll also find us on YouTube, you'll find us on Twitter and other places. We also have a newsletter that goes out every single week, and it includes exclusive content that you won't find on our social media. So if you just want to keep learning more about the science of health, performance, body composition, and also just want to keep up with all the content we're putting out, the email newsletter is a great place to go.
100%. Anyway, I don't have anything else to add, so we'll see you guys next week.